I've played tons of games, and one of the more exciting things I get to do on a daily basis is procedurally work my way through tons of franchises. To date, I currently track 542 different franchises on my game list, and as I go through these games, I have different emotions. Sometimes I look forward to the sequel hoping that companies fixed issues. Sometimes I hope that the franchise maintains the same level of hype that the previous entry did. In a perfect world, all games would be great, but as we know, the world is far from perfect. So the topic of today's episode is going to be about 10 unworthy sequels. Jess Ragan6714 suggested this for the NES a while back, but the truth is I haven't played enough NES-based sequels to justify an episode. So as an olive branch, I'm going to talk about 10 games I feel were truly unworthy sequels. Let's begin. There was a time where I dedicated an entire month to just working through Sierra's point-and-click games. That was an era that I was somewhat involved in, but missed because I grew up during the era of Blockbuster, so playing games on my computer really wasn't a thing that I did, and even if I did, the good games were mostly at my grandmother's house. The computer I had when those games were going strong couldn't really run anything, and it wasn't until my grandmother bought me my first laptop that I was able to physically enjoy PC gaming to a capacity that would be considered normal. Space Quest was a series that consistently delivered humor courtesy of Mark Crow and Scott Murphy, also known as Two Guys from Andromeda. If you've ever played a Space Quest game, they all involve a guy who happens to be at the wrong place at the right time. Roger Wilco, a space janitor that saves the galaxy time and time again. The whole series was awesome up until the bitter end with Space Quest 6, which to me existed during a time where point-and-click games were slowly fading out in favor of 3D worlds. It had horrible voice acting, the game flow was weird, the Sierra Moon logic was through the roof, and between me and you, I can't really remember much about the plot, it was that forgettable. In some ways, it felt like a huge step backwards, at least in the earlier portion of the franchise we could see as technology and engines improved, but that wasn't the case with this one. There was supposed to be another game, Space Quest 7 Return to Roman Numerals, but unfortunately Vivendi, who bought Sierra after they were destroyed by CompuCard International, felt that nobody wanted point-and-click games anymore, so the franchise died. Growing up, I wasn't big on first-person shooters. My dad would skin me alive if I played Doom, so the closest thing I ever got to a boomer shooter was Serious Sam, which I played through GameTap. Remember that? As an adult, I played Duke Nukem 3D, and, you ready for it? I fucking hated it. At least on the Nintendo 64. But then I went back and played the earlier Duke games, and the first was trash, but the second wasn't that bad. And finally, it was time to tackle Duke Nukem Forever. Now, I mentioned that I hadn't played any Duke games growing up, right? But I think we all knew about the legendary development hell that this game went through. For 14 years, they would hint at it. Then it would become irrelevant. Then a leak would happen. Then it would fade away. And finally, in 2011, Gearbox managed to release it. And it only took me about 10 minutes to realize that this was 100% fan service. Duke Nukem Forever was more than an FPS. It had adventure elements, so we were exploring the areas we were confined to. There were puzzles, which is something that you should never have in an FPS. And while we're at it, let's just make the game slow as shit when it comes to game flow. Really pad the nonsense while we're inundated with toilet humor and boobs that worked in the 90s, but was so irrelevant in the early 2010s. This was a bargain bin game at best, and I could not wait for it to be over. It kept going on and on and on with endless corridors of bullshit and shitty one-liners. Wasn't for me. I loved Mortal Kombat. That was a game that my dad had on the Genesis, and to be honest, it was the only graphic game I played as a kid. There was something about Mortal Kombat that my dad didn't mind. It was probably because he knew I wouldn't have the patience to learn any of the fatalities, and the internet was a luxury back then. So the only way for me to find out about the fatalities was to hear about them in the schoolyard, people telling me about these epic finishers that I would probably never see. As time went on, I played the shit out of Mortal Kombat, where my dad limited my M-rated experiences. My grandparents didn't care. I mean, my grandmother did raise an eyebrow sometimes, but I would tell her, it's a fighting game, it's not that bad. And she would shrug, and cowabunga it was. I played Deadly Alliance and Deception, both of which were extremely fun games, Then it came time for Armageddon, and whew, it was fan service. Don't get me wrong, it was incredible to see literally every character I had seen throughout the years converge into one capstone of the Mortal Kombat franchise. The Conquest mode wasn't that bad, Taven was kind of a dildo, but it offered some more replayability. The Creative Fighter was cool. I remember seeing all these dope custom builds on internet forums, but the novelty of the whole game wore off pretty quickly, and the whole creative fatality system was just lazy as hell to me. In some cases, it felt like most of the characters were just copied and pasted. Thankfully, the franchise has moved in a very positive direction, and it pleases me that the franchise still thrives to this day, and I hope that it does. It's one of the pioneers of the fighting genre. If you've watched previous episodes of mine, I mentioned that there was a holy trinity of badass action platformers on the PS2. Sly Cooper, Ratchet & Clank, and finally, Jak and Daxter. I remember renting Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy from Blockbuster and having my jaw drop to the ground. This was hands down the most fun I had on the console to date. The characters were funny, the animation was smooth, and even though it was a collectathon, I didn't mind. I grew up in that era where Donkey Kong 64 and Spyro were wasting our time having us collecting items that literally meant nothing in the end, but we wanted to accomplish something, so fuck it. My love for the Precursor Legacy had me excited and primed to check out Jak 2, and then I played it. Jak 2 picks up where we left off, and I don't want to spoil it, but we end up in Haven City, which is a slum-ass town ruled by Baron Praxis, and I do mean slum-ass town. It's chocked to the brim with vehicles, people on crack walking around, and of course guards that really hate us. 90% of the game will be running back and forth doing missions or doing monotonous tasks to advance the plot, and don't even bother trying to take a car and stealing it to drive anywhere because it's quicker to walk than driving a car. The civilian AI in this game is atrocious, and the steering is the equivalent of digging a hole with a fucking tennis racket. It just doesn't work. Pop in a horrible checkpoint system and an unnecessary focus on combat, and guess what? You have Jak 2. A hard-ass game that didn't need to be that way, but it was. Oh man, you know how we waited forever for Duke Nukem Forever? Yeah, hold my beer. Shenmue 3, even as a thought process, was something that took forever to manifest. For anyone who hasn't played Shenmue, it's basically a day in the life of a guy simulator, a true adventure game that blends realism with an unrealistic plot. Shenmue has us playing as Ryo Hazuki, who is basically going on a revenge mission while also doing some internal soul searching. Basically, the way it works is that our progress in the plot is dictated by information we obtain and speaking to the populace of wherever we are. There are no clear-cut objectives outside of the notes and thoughts that Ryo puts in his journal. Now, Shenmue 2 is also a great game, but not nearly as novel as the first. The failure of the Dreamcast meant that the whole idea of continuing Shenmue wasn't practical, and with Yakuza being mildly successful, the whole framework of Shenmue was already being capitalized on. It would take 18 years for Shenmue 3 to manifest. And guess what? It was disappointing! Yu Suzuki kept the same nonsense that was popular in the 90s, and the modern generation had no insight into the elements of gaming from that era. And the people who did, we were so used to the adventure genre moving forward, so the canned conversations, paywalls, collectathons, literally everything about this game was off-putting. And guess what? Yu Suzuki's greedy ass didn't finish the story. Shenmue 3 was crowdfunded. Let me say that again. Crowdfunded. So why not just end the story? Because he wants Shenmue 4 and 5, but I can comfortably say that will never happen. He blew his shot. Maintaining a cult following may have worked in the 90s, but it doesn't work now. So sorry, Ryo. I guess you'll never avenge your father. You know, so many people have their perspective on Mass Effect 3, and in some ways I agree, and in other ways I don't. Mass Effect 1 and 2 were phenomenal games, each with their own strengths and their weaknesses, and if you paid attention to the story or how it flowed, you could see the writing on the wall that this was meant to be a trilogy. It wasn't designed to be some 10-game franchise. This is BioWare we're talking about. They historically weren't known for putting in tons of games into a franchise. BioWare only released 2 Baldur's Gate entries, 2 Knights of the Old Republic entries, 1 title concerning Neverwinter Nights, and for a long time even Dragon Age only had 3 games. So here we are at Mass Effect 3 with an ending that people historically hold disdain for, and guess what? They're right. There is a futility of choice in what we do. I don't really want to spoil this for anyone, so I'm going to put up a spoiler alert, and if you want to miss out on this portion, go to the time code that's listed down below to move past this section. You'll only miss the ending of this portion. For those who are still here, we've gone through Mass Effect 1, we've killed Saren and Sovereign, we survived the suicide mission from Mass Effect 2, and we pushed back the Reapers in what I would consider a tremendous effort from those we see in the story. And at the end, we get 3 different endings. We can either choose to control the Reapers, destroy the Reapers, or merge all organic and synthetic life. What does this mean? It means that no matter what ending we choose, Shepard will die, the Reapers go bye-bye, the Citadel gets blown up, the mass relays are destroyed, and the Normandy gets hit and knocked into some random planet. It's the classic illusion of choice. No matter what we do, the outcome is determined for us. It's a really shitty way to end the game, but to be honest, I do like the game. But the ending is whatever, and it didn't have to be, but it was. Oh well. I adore Assassin's Creed. In fact, we've talked about this franchise a few times lately, and guess what? I'm going to keep talking about it even more, because the next Ready Go Gaming show is all about Ubisoft, from start to now. And with Assassin's Creed being one of their flagship franchises, we will be covering it, so look out for that. Now, I've always loved Assassin's Creed. The first one was kind of iffy, but it was a proof of concept. The entire Ezio storyline was exemplary, and then we jumped to a post-Desmond world with Abstergo Studios. I didn't mind number 3, Black Flag was perhaps one of my favorite, Rogue was mind-boggling, then we had Unity. Let me tell you, playing Unity is the equivalent of riding in a horse-drawn carriage from Los Angeles to New York City while being sandwiched between Amy Schumer and Kathy Griffin. Think about that. Unity was plagued with innumerable issues that were avoidable. For starters, the story was dog shit. In previous Assassin's Creed games, the event that led our protagonist to joining the Assassin Order are well built. They make sense, but Unity straight up took a line from Harry Potter getting invited to Hogwarts, and it was just so fucking dumb. Also, you know the cool moves that we've grown accustomed to? The dual assassinations, the efficient combat? Yeah, you'll have to pay for those with Ubisoft points, or naturally expand on a skill tree. Also, if it was up to Ubisoft, you would believe that Paris in 1789 was riddled with rooftops that defy physics and logic. I can't tell you how many times I've fallen through buildings because of bugs. It was a horrible continuation of the story. Actrazer is one of my favorite games on the Super Nintendo. It was also one of the first games that I played on an emulator known as Z-SNES. That was a time to be alive. The power of emulation at our fingertips saved us so much money, even though at the time, collecting retro games probably wouldn't have been nearly as expensive as it is today. But I digress. Actrazer was a game that blew my mind. I didn't know what to expect. All I know is that I moved over monster layers and then went into the lair as this badass angel known as the Master and absolutely annihilated every enemy that came my way. And then I fought intuitive bosses. To me, that's all I expected from this game. Then the second aspect showed up, the town management. We listened to the concerns of the townsfolk, guided them where we wanted them to build, asked them to seal monster layers, and as the game went on, it got more and more interesting. To me, this is easily one of the best games on the Super Nintendo, period. Then Quintet released Actrazer 2, which was heavily influenced by the folks at Enix, who did not like the city management. So instead of a top-tier continuation to Actrazer, the only thing that was present were the action sequences. Don't get me wrong, I love platformers, sometimes, but when you've given consumers a level of expectations and then you radically change it, that directly affects consumer confidence in your product. Actrazer 2 was a horribly frustrating game. It's one of those games that are so fucking hard that you drop down the difficulty, make it 95% through the game just to be told, no sir, try a harder difficulty, and then get sent back to the title screen. Fuck you! Seriously, fuck you! So you go through the whole game again, deal with an obnoxiously tough and horribly designed boss, and then you beat it. Yay. Honorable mention to the jack shit remastering of Actrazer 1 known as Actrazer Renaissance. That game was a hammer to the nuts for folks who wanted to remember Actrazer 1. When we discuss subpar sequels, this game will always come up, and it's a valid concern. Devil May Cry was a smash hit from Capcom. People looked forward to it, and then Devil May Cry 2 was released. If you've ever played Devil May Cry, you know it's a hack and slash fan's wet dream. The combat was fluid, the action was almost non-stop, and it was good, clean fun. And Capcom had the roadmap to make another great game, but they decided to completely overhaul the directorial process of the game. And that resulted in people who literally had no idea how to make the concept of Devil May Cry survive. The devs didn't know how to program 3D action games, the game was consistently reorganized and rebuilt, and everyone from the top all the way to the bottom had free reign to do whatever they wanted to, and that resulted in an exceptionally subpar game, and it failed miserably to capture the success of the first game. In fact, most people step over it because Devil May Cry 3 would be a prequel anyway. This is just a rough game, and personally, I expected better from Capcom. Kingdom Hearts was one of my favorite games as a kid. The unique blend of Disney IPs with Final Fantasy characters was so cool to me, even though their presence really wasn't that impactful. It was still nice, right? I know I've mentioned it before, but when I played this as a kid, I did not know what a Japanese role-playing game was, at all. I approached this as a hack and slash action adventure game, and I beat it, and I was so happy to beat it. Then, for whatever reason, they released Chain of Memories on the Game Boy Advance. And between you and me, I've always had this mental stance that franchises that jump to handhelds, they go there to die. It's the Florida of the video game industry. Then randomly in 2003, Squeenix decided to announce Kingdom Hearts 2, and I was elated. So was a vast majority of folks who really enjoyed the first game. I will say Kingdom Hearts 2, it isn't a bad game, it is just incredibly hand-holding. Before every fight, we have a weird loading screen that tells us what we are doing or what we need to do, which isn't necessary. There's QuickTime events that really don't fit into the game at all, and the game was stupid easy. The AI commands we had before were kind of dulled down, healing items felt redundant, and it truly felt like a hand-holding game. That's the best way I can say it. It's still whimsical and fun, but to me it isn't nearly as interesting as the first game. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? What sequels historically made you drop the controller and leave the room? Feel free to tell us down in the comments section below. Who knows, maybe you'll expose someone in the community to a fantastic experience. Speaking of our community, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're gathering a phenomenal video game enthusiasts that love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you align with that, feel free to subscribe. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly affects the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.